Step away from the patient. The words didn't belong to anyone in the surgical circle, yet they sliced cleanly through the low hum of machines and the quiet authority of white coats. And for a split second, no one moved. Then a few soft chuckles broke the silence as heads turned toward the edge of the room where Ava Johnson stood, her gray janitor's uniform catching the sterile overhead light. A mop bucket still parked against the wall behind her like a reminder of where she was supposed to stay, the smell of antiseptic. Thick in the air, the steady beep of the heart monitor marking each passing second with quiet urgency. Dr. Richard Coleman didn't even look at her at first, his gloved hands poised with practiced confidence, his voice calm, almost amused. "We don't need commentary from maintenance," he said, and a ripple of restrained laughter followed, the kind that lives just under professionalism, the kind that assumes it's safe to dismiss. Ava didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor, on the subtle shift in rhythm that most in the room hadn't noticed yet, her breathing slow, measured, like she had been here before, even if no one believed she belonged. "You're about to make a mistake," she said, her voice steady, not loud, not pleading, just certain, and that certainty made the laughter falter, if only for a second. Coleman finally glanced up, a brief flicker of irritation crossing his face, the surgical lights reflecting sharply in his glasses. "You clean floors," he replied, colder now. "Stay in your place." Around him, a few doctors exchanged looks, some amused, some uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. The machine beeped again, slightly faster this time. A subtle shift, easy to ignore if you weren't listening for it. Ava took one step forward, just one, enough to move out of the shadow and into the full brightness of the room, her presence suddenly harder to overlook. "Wrong artery," she said quietly, her gaze unwavering. "If you cut there, he won't make it." The words hung in the air, heavier now, the kind that demand attention whether you want to give it or not. Someone near the back let out a nervous laugh, another shook their head, disbelief written across their face, because what could she possibly know? A janitor standing in a place that required years of training and titles she didn't wear. Coleman's jaw tightened, the confidence in his posture shifting just enough to be noticed, but not enough to admit doubt. "Security," he called without raising his voice, as if removing her was as routine as adjusting a light. Footsteps moved toward her from the doorway, slow, deliberate, and still Ava didn't move back. The monitor beeped again, sharper now, the rhythm no longer as steady, and for the first time, a few eyes drifted from Coleman's hands to the screen. Ava's reflection caught in the polished metal of the equipment, her expression calm, almost still, as if the chaos around her hadn't reached her yet. "Look again," she said, softer this time, but somehow louder in the silence that followed. And then the doors at the far end of the room burst open, the sudden rush of movement cutting through everything, and a voice, firm and unmistakable, echoed across the sterile space. "Why isn't Dr. Ava Johnson leading this procedure?" The room did not move, but everything inside it shifted, the kind of shift that no one could name yet, but everyone could feel, like the air had grown heavier in a single breath, and Dr. Coleman's hands paused just long enough to betray the smallest crack in his certainty while the voice at the door echoed again. Firmer now, closer. "I asked why Dr. Ava Johnson is not leading this procedure," and every head turned as the hospital director stepped into the surgical light, her presence cutting through the tension with quiet authority, her heels striking the floor in steady, deliberate steps that seemed louder than they should have been in a room built for silence. Ava did not turn immediately, her eyes still on the monitor, watching the rhythm, listening to it in a way that felt almost instinctive, while the staff around her exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces as the title hung in the air. Dr. Ava Johnson, not janitor, not outsider, but something none of them had allowed themselves to see. Coleman straightened, a reflex born from years of control, but the confidence in his posture no longer sat as easily as it had moments before, his voice measured, careful now. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, though even he could hear the uncertainty threading through his words, the kind that does not belong in a room like this. The director's gaze did not leave Ava, not once, as she stepped closer to the operating table, her tone calm but unmistakable. "There is no misunderstanding," she said. She is the only specialist in this building who has studied this condition in depth, and the words landed with a weight that silenced any remaining doubt in the room. The earlier laughter now replaced with something quieter, heavier, something closer to realization. Ava finally shifted, just enough to meet the director's eyes. A brief exchange that needed no explanation, no introduction, because whatever history existed between them was already understood, already recognized, and in that moment, the lines that had separated roles and titles began to blur in the minds of everyone watching. The monitor beeped again, sharper now, pulling attention back to the patient, back to the reason they were all there, and Ava stepped forward without hesitation, her movements precise, controlled, as if she had been standing in that exact spot all along, as if nothing about this moment was new to her except the way others were finally seeing it. "We do not have time," she said, her voice steady, not raised, not rushed, but carrying across the room with a clarity that demanded focus, and one by one, the team adjusted, stepping aside, making space, not because they were told to, but because something in her presence made it impossible not to. Coleman remained still for a fraction longer, the last to move, his eyes searching her face as if trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what stood in front of him now. And for the first time, he did not interrupt, did not correct, did not dismiss. Ava glanced at the chart, then at the monitor, her fingers hovering just above the instruments before settling with quiet confidence, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "The signal was there the whole time," she said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating a truth that felt larger than the moment itself. And as the team followed her lead, the room settled into a different kind of silence, not one filled with dismissal, but one built on attention, on listening, on the slow, undeniable recognition that something important had just shifted. And as the steady rhythm returned to the monitor, the sound carried through the room like a quiet answer to everything that had been doubted just minutes before. The room did not erupt in applause. It did not need to, because the change was quieter than that, deeper, settling into the way every person stood, the way every pair of eyes followed Ava, now not with doubt, but with attention, and the steady rhythm of the monitor filled the space like a quiet confirmation that her voice had been right all along, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. And that clarity lingered even after her hands moved away from the instruments, even after the tension in the air began to loosen into something steadier, something closer to trust. Ava stepped back just slightly, removing her gloves with slow, deliberate movements, the soft snap of the material breaking the silence in a way that felt almost symbolic. And for a moment, she simply looked at the patient, at the rising and falling numbers on the screen, as if grounding herself in the outcome rather than the reaction around her. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Even the smallest sounds, the shifting of feet, the faint rustle of fabric, seemed to wait their turn, as if the room itself understood that something had changed that could not be undone. Dr. Coleman stood a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid but not entirely relaxed either, caught somewhere between what he had been and what he was beginning to realize. His gaze fixed on Ava with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with understanding, or at least the beginning of it. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again, as if the words he had relied on so easily before no longer fit the moment, and that hesitation said more than anything he could have spoken. The hospital director remained near the foot of the table, arms loosely crossed, watching not the procedure but the people, the subtle shifts in expression, the quiet recalibration happening in real time. And there was a faint nod in her posture, not dramatic, not performative, just acknowledgement. Ava turned slightly, her gaze moving across the team, not lingering, not seeking validation, simply observing. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Make sure the follow-up scans are reviewed within the hour," she said, and the instruction landed with immediate response, a nurse nodding, another already reaching for the chart, because now her words were not questioned, they were followed. Coleman finally stepped forward, just one step, enough to close the distance that had felt so wide only minutes ago, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "I should have listened," he said, not loudly, not for the room, but the words carried anyway, settling into the space with a weight that felt real, not forced. Ava met his gaze for a brief second, long enough to acknowledge, short enough to keep moving. And there was no triumph in her expression, no trace of satisfaction, just a steady composure that made the moment feel even more significant, because she did not need to claim it. Next time, she said softly, listen to the data before the noise. And there was no accusation in it, only a lesson offered without bitterness. The director stepped forward then, her voice measured, clear, effective immediately. Dr. Ava Johnson will be overseeing all critical case reviews in this department. And the announcement did not shock the room the way it might have earlier, because in the last few minutes, everyone had already seen why. Ava did not react to the title, did not pause to absorb it. She simply turned toward the door, her steps unhurried, the same quiet rhythm she had carried into the room now guiding her out of it. And as she passed the spot where her mop bucket still stood, untouched, a few members of the staff glanced at it, then back at her, the contrast no longer something to laugh at, but something to remember. The door opened with a soft push, the hallway beyond filled with the muted sounds of the hospital continuing as it always had. But for those inside the room, the silence she left behind felt different, heavier in meaning, lighter in judgment. And as the steady beep of the monitor continued, it no longer marked tension, but something resolved, something understood, something that would not be forgotten the next time someone spoke from a place others were not expecting. The hallway outside the operating room felt cooler, quieter, but not empty, the fluorescent lights casting long reflections across the polished floor as Ava walked forward with the same steady pace she had carried inside, her footsteps soft but certain, each one echoing just enough to remind her she was no longer invisible in this building, not after what had just happened, not after what had been said out loud for everyone to hear. Nurses passed by, some slowing slightly, others pretending not to look, but their eyes followed her anyway, curiosity replacing the indifference that had once surrounded her, and even the distant hum of hospital equipment seemed to fade into the background as the weight of the moment lingered in the air behind her. She reached the corner where the corridor split, pausing just briefly as a cart rolled past, the scent of disinfectant rising again, familiar, grounding, and for a second, it felt like the countless nights she had spent here before, long after most had gone home, when the halls were empty and the only sound was the quiet rhythm of work no one noticed. But something was different now, something that could not be undone, and even she could feel it settling into her shoulders, not as pressure, but as recognition. Behind her, the operating room doors opened again, a sharper sound this time, and footsteps followed, quicker, less certain, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. Dr. Johnson. Coleman's voice carried down the hallway, no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but measured, almost careful, as if each word had to pass through a different filter than before. Ava stopped, then turned slowly, her expression composed, giving him the space to speak without offering anything more than attention. He approached, closing the distance that had once felt defined by hierarchy, his lab coat shifting slightly as he moved, his hands no longer occupied, no longer shielded by routine. I reviewed the data again, he said, his voice lower now, steadier but not as certain as it used to be. You were right from the start. The words hung there, simple, direct, and heavier than any apology he could have constructed, because they carried admission, not just of error, but of perspective. Ava held his gaze for a moment, not searching, not challenging, just listening, and then she nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged the truth without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. The signs were there, she replied, her tone calm. They just were not the ones everyone expected to see. Coleman exhaled quietly, a subtle release of something unspoken, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the hallway stretching around them, busy but distant, as if the world had shifted just enough to give space to this exchange. A nurse passed behind him, glancing between them, sensing the change but not fully understanding it, and that uncertainty lingered in the air like a question waiting to be answered over time rather than in a single moment. I have been here for 20 years, Coleman said after a pause, his voice carrying a different weight now, less about authority and more about reflection, and I thought I had seen everything that mattered. Ava's eyes softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, the kind that comes from knowing how easily experience can become limitation when it stops listening. Experience matters, she said, but only if it stays open. The words were quiet, but they settled between them with clarity, not as criticism, but as direction. From the far end of the hallway, the hospital director's voice echoed faintly, calling for updates, the rhythm of the building continuing as it always did, but the moment between them held just long enough to mark the shift that had begun inside that room. Coleman gave a small nod, not the kind that signals conclusion, but the kind that acknowledges change, and as Ava turned again to continue down the corridor, the distance between them no longer felt like separation, but like something that had been crossed, not in steps, but in understanding, and as she moved forward, the light from the overhead fixtures followed her path, reflecting off the floor in a quiet, steady line that seemed to stretch further than before. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Ava stepped inside without hesitation, the quiet enclosure reflecting her image back at her in brushed steel, her posture straight, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying something deeper, something earned, as the doors closed behind her and the outside noise faded into a muted hum, leaving only the low mechanical vibration beneath her feet and the faint echo of everything that had just unfolded. She pressed the button for the upper floor, the one most staff rarely visited unless called, and as the numbers began to climb, each passing floor felt less like movement and more like transition, as if she were crossing an invisible line that had always been there, just never acknowledged. Down on the surgical floor, the atmosphere had not returned to normal, not fully, because moments like that do not disappear, they settle into memory, into behavior, into the way people speak and listen, and inside the operating room. The staff continued their work, but quieter now, more deliberate, each instruction checked twice, each decision carrying a new awareness that something they once overlooked had just changed everything. Coleman remained near the table for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze drifting toward the door Ava had walked through, the echo of her words still present, not as criticism, but as a standard, and when he finally turned back to the monitors, his focus was different, less about proving control and more about understanding what he might have missed before. A nurse beside him adjusted a setting, then paused, glancing at him as if expecting correction, but when none came, she continued, a small shift, but one that rippled outward in ways none of them could yet measure. Back inside the elevator, the soft light reflected across Ava's face as she exhaled slowly, the first real breath she had allowed herself since stepping into that operating room, her hand resting lightly against the rail, grounding herself not in the recognition she had just received, but in the purpose that had brought her there long before anyone had noticed. The doors opened again onto a quieter floor, the kind where footsteps are softer and voices lower, where decisions are made behind glass walls and closed doors, and as she stepped out, the air felt different, cooler, more controlled, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and paper rather than disinfectant. Down the corridor, a few administrators looked up from their work, their expressions shifting from routine acknowledgement to something more attentive as they recognized her, not the uniform she had worn before, but the name that had just been spoken in a room where it mattered. The hospital director stood near the end of the hall, waiting, her presence steady, composed, as if she had expected this exact moment to arrive, and when Ava approached, there was no ceremony, no grand gesture, just a quiet understanding exchange between them. "You handled that exactly as I hoped you would," the director said, her voice low, measured, and Ava gave a small nod, not out of pride, but out of alignment, because for her, it had never been about proving anything, only about doing what was right in the moment it mattered. "They will remember," the director added, glancing briefly toward the lower floors as if she could see through the building itself, "not because of what you said, but because of how you said it." Ava's gaze followed for a second, thoughtful, then returned, her expression unchanged but her presence unmistakably different now, not louder, not more forceful, just seen. Somewhere below, the steady rhythm of the hospital continued, machines humming, voices calling, lives unfolding in quiet urgency. But for those who had been in that room, something had shifted that would not fade, and as Ava stepped forward into the next corridor, the light from the tall windows at the far end stretched across the floor, meeting her halfway, as if the path ahead had always been waiting, just out of view until now. The window at the end of the corridor stretched from floor to ceiling, casting a soft, natural light across the polished surface beneath Ava's feet. And for a moment, she stopped there, not out of hesitation, but out of quiet reflection, her silhouette outlined against the city beyond, where traffic moved in steady lines and life continued without pause, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside these walls. The hospital behind her carried its usual rhythm, distant announcements echoing softly, carts rolling past, conversations blending into a low, constant hum. But here, in this narrow space between motion and stillness, everything felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed just enough to let the weight of the moment settle. Ava rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, the faint vibration of the building barely noticeable, her breath steady, her posture unchanged. Yet something deeper had shifted, something not visible in titles or recognition, but in the way silence now held a different meaning around her. She had walked these halls before, countless times, unseen, her presence blending into the background, her thoughts kept to herself, her knowledge carried quietly without expectation of being heard. And yet, today, the same walls reflected her differently, not because they had changed, but because the way people saw her had. A nurse passed behind her, slowing for just a second, offering a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just genuine, and Ava returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement. No more, no less, because nothing about her required adjustment, only recognition. The light shifted slightly as clouds moved across the sky, softening the brightness, casting a gentler tone across the corridor, and Ava closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to center herself in the calm that followed intensity, the kind of calm that does not erase what happened, but gives it space to settle into something meaningful. Down below, on the surgical floor, the monitors continued their steady rhythm, the patient stable now, the team moving with a new level of awareness, and though no one said it out loud, the difference was there in every step, every glance, every decision that now carried a second layer of thought, a second voice that would not be dismissed so easily again. Back at the window, Ava opened her eyes and looked out once more, the reflection of the hospital lights faintly visible over the city view, merging two worlds into one image, and in that reflection, she saw not just who she was in this moment, but every version of herself that had led her here, every late night, every silent observation, every moment she had chosen to keep going even when no one noticed. The quiet around her did not feel empty. It felt full, filled with everything that had been unspoken now finding its place, not in noise, but in presence. Footsteps approached softly from behind, but she did not turn immediately. She did not need to, because whatever came next would not undo what had already been established. And when she finally stepped away from the glass, her movement was unhurried, grounded, carrying forward the same quiet strength that had defined her long before anyone had given it a name. The corridor stretched ahead, open, lit evenly, each step forward reflecting in the polished floor like a continuation of something already in motion. And as she walked, the silence followed her, not as absence, but as understanding, the kind that does not need words to be heard. The announcement came quietly, but it moved faster than any emergency call, slipping through hallways, across departments, into conversations that paused mid-sentence as names and titles were repeated with a new tone. And by the time Ava reached the central atrium, the shift was no longer contained to one room or one floor. It had spread, subtle but undeniable, carried in glances, in lowered voices, in the way people adjusted when she passed, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that something they had overlooked had just redefined the space they worked in. The atrium's ceiling rose high above, sunlight pouring through the glass panels and scattering across the floor in wide, bright patterns, and for a moment, the entire building felt open, exposed in a way that made every detail sharper, every movement more intentional. A group of residents stood near the reception desk, their conversation fading as Ava walked by, one of them straightening instinctively, another lowering his voice, not out of fear, but out of awareness, and though no one addressed her directly, the silence they left behind spoke clearly enough. On a screen mounted near the wall, Patient updates scrolled steadily, names and numbers moving in quiet order, and among them, a small line appeared, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The case she had just corrected now marked stable, and that single word carried more weight than any recognition spoken aloud. Behind her, footsteps approached again, lighter this time, quicker, and when she turned slightly, it was not Coleman, but one of the younger doctors from the operating room, his expression uncertain but determined, as if he had been debating whether to speak since the moment she walked out. "Dr. Johnson," he said, the title careful on his tongue, not yet natural, but sincere, and Ava paused just enough to acknowledge him, giving him the space to continue. I missed it," he admitted, his voice low, honest. "The signal you saw, I reviewed the chart twice and still did not catch it." Ava studied him for a brief second, not judging, not correcting, simply observing, and then she nodded slightly, her response measured. "You were looking for the expected pattern," she said, "but not every case follows what you expect." He exhaled slowly, absorbing the words, not as criticism, but as something to carry forward, and there was a shift in his posture, subtle but real, the kind that comes from understanding rather than instruction. "How did you see it so quickly?" he asked, not challenging, but curious, and Ava glanced toward the screen again, the steady progression of information reflecting faintly in her eyes. "Because I have seen what happens when it gets missed," she replied, her voice quiet, grounded in experience rather than theory, and that answer settled between them, deeper than any technical explanation could have. The doctor nodded, slower this time, as if something larger than the moment had just clicked into place, and when he stepped back, it was not to retreat, but to make room, to carry that awareness into whatever came next. Around them, the atrium continued its rhythm, staff moving, patients being guided, conversations restarting, but there was a new layer beneath it all, a quiet recalibration that could not be undone, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Ava turned again, continuing forward through the open space, her reflection briefly catching in the glass panels that lined the upper floors, and for the first time, those reflections did not blend into the background. They stood out, defined, not louder, not brighter, just present in a way that did not require explanation. Above, the sunlight shifted slightly, casting a longer line across the floor ahead of her, and as she stepped into it, the building seemed to move with her, not in structure, but in perception, as if every hallway, every room, every quiet corner had adjusted just enough to recognize what had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The conference room on the upper floor was quieter than the rest of the hospital, the kind of quiet that carried weight, where decisions did not need to be loud to be final, and as Ava stepped inside, the soft click of the door closing behind her seemed to settle the air even further, drawing the attention of everyone seated around the long glass table. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows, muted now by late afternoon light, casting a warm reflection across polished surfaces, but inside the room, the focus remained fixed, not on the view, but on her. The hospital director stood at the head of the table, composed as always, while several senior staff members sat with files open in front of them, their posture more formal than before, their expressions measured, waiting. Ava moved forward without hesitation, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, and when she reached the chair offered to her, she did not rush to sit. She simply placed her hands lightly on the backrest, acknowledging the room before taking her place, not above them, not beneath them, but among them. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to underline the shift that had brought her here, and then the director began, her voice calm, precise. "What happened downstairs has already been reviewed," she said, her gaze moving briefly across the table before returning to Ava, "and the conclusion is clear." A few heads nodded subtly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition, the kind that follows undeniable evidence rather than opinion. Coleman sat halfway down the table, his posture straighter than usual, his attention fixed, and when the director paused, he spoke, his voice steady but quieter than before. "The oversight was mine," he said, not looking away, and the correction was hers. The admission did not create tension, it released it, because it removed the need for anyone else to say it. And in that moment, the room shifted again, not in power, but in clarity. Ava listened without interruption, her expression calm, her focus steady, and when the director turned to her, inviting her perspective without needing to say the words directly, Ava spoke simply. The case followed a pattern that was easy to overlook if you were expecting something else, she said, her tone even, her words measured. But the indicators were consistent if you knew where to look. No one interrupted, no one challenged, and that silence carried respect in a way that required no reinforcement. A senior physician at the far end leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his voice thoughtful, and moving forward, he asked, "How do we ensure that we do not miss it again?" Ava's gaze shifted to him, steady, grounded, and for a brief second, the room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting not just for an answer, but for direction. "We listen," she said, not raising her voice, not emphasizing the word, but letting it settle naturally. Not just to data that confirms what we expect, but to anything that challenges it. The simplicity of the statement made it stronger, not weaker, and as it landed, a few of them exchanged brief glances, not in doubt, but in reflection, because the solution was not complicated, it was disciplined. The director nodded once, a small gesture that carried decision within it, and then she spoke again, her tone clear, final, effective immediately. "Dr. Ava Johnson will lead cross-department case evaluations," she said, her voice steady, "and all critical reviews will pass through her team before final decisions are made." The words settled into the room without resistance, because by now, the outcome felt less like a change and more like alignment. Ava did not react outwardly, did not shift in her seat, did not acknowledge the weight of the role in any visible way, because for her, the responsibility had never been about position, it had always been about the work itself. Around the table, files were adjusted, notes were taken, and the conversation began to move forward, but the tone had changed, not louder, not more intense, just more aware, as if every voice now carried a quiet reminder of what had almost been missed and what had been found just in time. Outside the window, the light continued to soften, the city moving toward evening, and inside, the room moved with a different kind of rhythm, one shaped not by hierarchy, but by attention, and as Ava sat among them, her presence steady, her voice measured, the shift that had started in a single moment now settled into something lasting, something that would carry beyond this room, beyond this day, into every decision that followed. The meeting ended without ceremony, chairs sliding back softly, papers gathered, voices returning in low, controlled tones, but something in the room did not reset to what it had been before. It carried forward, subtle but permanent, and as Ava rose from her seat, the glass table reflected her movement in a clean, uninterrupted line, steady, composed, unchanged in posture but transformed in presence. No one rushed to speak to her, no one needed to, because the acknowledgement had already been given in the only way that mattered, through action, through decision, through the quiet alignment that had replaced doubt. Coleman remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table, his gaze following her as she stepped away, and there was no tension left in his expression, only a thoughtful stillness, the kind that comes after something fundamental has shifted, not forced, not imposed, but understood. Ava moved toward the door, her steps unhurried, and as she reached for the handle, the late afternoon light from the windows caught along the edge of the room, casting a soft glow across the floor that followed her path, not dramatic, not symbolic, just present, like everything else that had led to this point. The hallway outside felt different now, not quieter, not louder, just clearer, as if the noise had settled into something more organized, more intentional, and as she walked, people no longer looked past her, they looked at her, not with curiosity, not with surprise, but with recognition that required no explanation. A nurse passed by and offered a small, genuine smile. Another staff member stepped aside without hesitation, not out of formality, but out of awareness, and Ava acknowledged each gesture the same way she always had, with calm, with balance, without allowing it to alter her pace or her focus. At the far end of the corridor, the large windows revealed the city beginning to shift into evening, the light lowering, shadows stretching longer across the streets below, and for a moment, Ava slowed, not to stop, but to take in the transition, The way the world outside moved forward just as steadily as everything inside these walls. Behind her, conversations resumed, plans adjusted, decisions carried out with a new layer of attention. And though her name would be spoken in rooms she was not in, though her role would now shape outcomes beyond what anyone had expected before, none of it changed the way she walked, the way she observed, the way she listened. She reached the end of the hall and turned, her reflection briefly catching in the glass beside her, no longer blending into the background, but standing clearly defined, not elevated, not separated, just seen. The elevator doors opened with a soft tone, and she stepped inside, the space quiet, enclosed, the reflection of the day lingering in the stillness. And as the doors closed, the last glimpse of the corridor faded, leaving only the faint hum of motion as the car began to descend. Floor by floor, the building moved around her,